Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again for JoBlo.com with another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw. And this week we're taking a look at the underrated and underseen early Sylvester Stallone vehicle, Nighthawks. In it, the late Rutger Hauer plays an international terrorist named Wolfgar, who's been rendered nearly unrecognizable after plastic surgery. He flees to New York City. Enter NYPD cop Deke DeSilvia, played by a very young and very bearded Sylvester Stallone, who, along with his partner Fox, played by Billy D. Williams, Lando Calrissian himself, finds himself transferred to a newly created anti-terrorism unit in order to take down the cold-blooded murderous Wolfgar once and for all. Now, in addition to Sylvester Stallone, Billy D. Williams, and Rutger Hauer, this movie also co-stars Persis Khambatta, who you may remember as the bald Ilea in Star Trek the Motion Picture, and for playing the love interest in perhaps the greatest film of all time, Megaforce. It's directed by Bruce Malmuth, although it was originally started by Gary Nelson, and word has it Sylvester Stallone ghost-directed much of the film himself. Now, the history behind Nighthawks is pretty compelling stuff. Originally, the film was conceived as a third French Connection sequel, which would have pitted Gene Hackman's Popeye Doyle up against the terrorist modeled on the infamous Carlos the Jackal, while also pairing him with a partner that producers hoped would be played by Richard Pryor, who was making quite a few serious movies back in that era, including Paul Schrader's amazing and underrated Blue Collar. The project went kaput when Hackman decided he had had enough of playing Popeye Doyle and wanted to branch out. So the script made its way to Universal, where it was redeveloped into a project for Sylvester Stallone, who was then coming off of the first two Rocky movies, meaning he was a star, but not quite the icon he would become. Let's not forget, Paradise Alley was not a hit. Sylvester Stallone, in a Q&A with Ain't It Cool News years ago, as Sly said himself, and no, I'm not doing an impersonation, Nighthawks was a very difficult film to make, namely because no one believed that urban terrorism would ever happen in New York, thus the story was felt to be far-fetched. Nighthawks was an even better film before the studio lost faith in it and cut it to pieces. What was in the missing scenes was extraordinary acting by Rutger Hauer, Lindsay Wagner, and a finale that was a bloodfest that rivaled the finale of Taxi Driver. But it was a bloodfest with a purpose. And sadly, despite several Blu-ray re-releases, the director's cut of Nighthawks has never been found. Even still, we have to think of Nighthawks in the context in which it was made. Rutger Hauer had recently become an art house heartthrob when his Paul Verhoeven films Turkish Delight and Soldier of Orange made their way to North America, so he was imported to play the terrorist Wolfgar. Fitting their on-screen animosity, Stallone and Hauer quickly went to war on set, although both admitted years later that in the end they had a grudging respect for each other's work and that bygones were just that, bygones. The tension wasn't helped by the fact that after a week, director Gary Nelson, who was then coming off of two Disney movies, Freaky Friday and The Black Hole, and not necessarily the guy that you'd get to direct this hardcore action thriller, was fired, briefly leaving the production without a director. Stallone stepped in but got into hot water with the Directors Guild of America, and Bruce Malmuth, whose biggest project up to that point had been an after-school special, was hired. Smooth sailing it was not, with the finished film being cut and recut, first by Sly, then by the studio. In the end, many of Stallone's dramatic scenes were cut, Billy D. Williams' character became minor when he was originally a co-lead, and Lindsay Wagner, then best known for TV's The Bionic Woman, found that most of her role was excised. She basically just has a cameo role in the film, and Hauer's big death scene was cut to ribbons. Even still, the movie did pretty well financially, grossing close to $20 million, which was 4 times its budget, although the movie is sadly pretty obscure nowadays. And in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, Stallone explained it by saying it was a little bit ahead of its time in that it was dealing with urban terrorism. Now with the World Trade Center, it's happening. At the time, however, people couldn't relate to it, and the studio, Universal, didn't believe in it. Rutger Hauer's performance held it together, and he was an excellent villain. Rutger Hauer himself explained his role in a Nerve.com interview by saying, "The more dangerous the villain, the more it gives credit to the hero. I read a book by a real terrorist who the character was based on, and it was pretty scary. And it wasn't a stupid book. The whole idea was, as a bad guy, you don't look like the devil, and you don't behave like an idiot. You know, I think the devil's very smart, probably smarter than all of us." Now, Nighthawks shouldn't be great. The whole production process sounds like it was a nightmare, and given how hastily it was cut and recut, it should be a movie that's pretty choppy. Yet, even if it's compromised, it works rather well thanks to the plot that at the time may have seemed far-fetched, but now is all too realistic. It's worth noting that Stallone's performances is really one of his best. I love Sly, but Sly pre-Rocky III and First Blood is a different beast. At the time, many saw him as a Brando-like method actor rather than an action hero, and as such, the movie is much more of a thriller than an action flick. When I was a kid and I saw Nighthawks on TV, I was disappointed. I was expecting Tango and Cash. Instead, I got something, of course, that's a lot more like The French Connection. Nowadays, I respect it and enjoy it a lot. The story and De Silva's horror at Wolfgar's actions are at the forefront, and notably, Sly only kills one person in the film, Wolfgar himself. It's the journey to that end that makes Nighthawks compelling, with him bristling at the idea that as a cop, he should be expected to coldly execute anyone. That he underestimated Wolfgar's sadism is what the plot hinges on, with Hauer's wild-eyed baddie stronger and smarter than De Silva could ever hope to be. But if he's gonna protect and serve, De Silva's gotta put him down. And their good versus evil tango is compelling, and oddly enough, the re-editing which sidelined Williams and Wagner may have actually helped the film in a way, because it makes the film much more about Stallone versus Hauer and a two-hander than an ensemble film, which maybe it was planned to be. It's worth noting that Hauer was at the peak of his abilities here, with Wolfgar magnetic throughout, and it's no wonder he started getting so many offers in the wake of this, with Blade Runner following the next year. The movie also has a cool, grimy, pre-Giuliani NYC vibe, and I'm not sure who should be getting the credit, Nelson, Melmoth, or Sly himself. It feels seedy in that late 70s, early 80s grindhouse way, with nifty character actors like Joe Spinell in the cast, and a funky progressive rock score by Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. There's nothing quite like Nighthawks, and while it's dated, I have to say, that's kind of part of its charm. Have you ever seen Sylvester Stallone in drag? Especially a fully bearded Sylvester Stallone? Well, if you watch Nighthawks, you'll get your chance, with his character having a very strange habit of dressing up as female decoys, something he does more than once in the film. It's a rather idiosyncratic touch, especially given the Serpico-style beard Stallone is rocking throughout, and I have to say, Sly looks cool in this flick. Now, the best way to see Nighthawks is without a doubt via the recent Shout Factory Blu-ray re-release. All previous DVD versions of the movie are missing music tracks like the Rolling Stones' Brown Sugar, and generally looked pretty bad. Shout Factory did a pretty good job restoring the movie to HD on Blu-ray and is the only way to go, but sadly they were not able to locate the director's cut of this film with the intact death scene and some of the missing scenes. It's too bad because all we really have are still images that suggest what it might have been and an extended version of Keith Emerson's score, which you could find on YouTube. Now, Nighthawks is one that's bound to surprise even the most devoted Sly fans. It falls into a very little examined period in his career, post-Rocky II and pre-Rocky III, where he was struggling to find his footing at the box office and Hollywood hadn't quite figured out what to do with him yet. While movies like Victory arguably miscast him as a soccer-playing goalie, Nighthawks cast him perfectly as this Pacino-style cop. If you've never heard of it, give Nighthawks a try because I think you'll love it. For JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumley.
You won't get away with it. You know that, don't you?
They could have cut out. But I'm not gonna spend my life running from you.
Something strange happened in 1988. Rambo 3, which was then considered the most expensive movie ever made, underwhelmed at the US box office, being outgrossed on Memorial Day weekend by Crocodile Dundee 2.
What are your chances of getting out of here with that jacket on?
Better than average.
In the end, it only made a fraction of what its predecessor, Rambo First Blood Part 2, had made, and as a result, it was a costly box office disappointment for Sylvester Stallone. What was even more troubling was that prior to Rambo 3, he had starred in Over the Top, which was a gigantic financial failure for Cannon Films, helping to sink the studio as one of 3 big flops they had that year, the other being Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, and Masters of the Universe. For Stallone, it must have seemed that his stardom was in jeopardy, and while he would indeed star in another legitimate box office hit in 1989, first he would star in a low-key action drama that today ranks as one of his most obscure vehicles, Lock Up. In it, Stallone plays a prisoner named Frank Leone. He's on the verge of completing a long stint in jail, and he's a model prisoner, looking forward to his release in 6 months so he can begin life with his long-suffering, stalwart girlfriend Melissa, played by the late Darlene Flugel. However, a vengeful former warden named Drumgoole has other plans. Leone once escaped jail under his watch, ruining his career, and somehow he's arranged a transfer for Leone to his hellish prison, Gateway.
Welcome to Gateway, Leone.
Drumgoole?
That's Warden's Drumgoole, convict.
Where he plans to torture Leone to somehow extending his sentence beyond 6 months.
Gateway, 6 months could be a lifetime. Anything can happen.
Now, Lock Up should have been a gritty action flick for Sylvester Stallone, and maybe even a classic. It had a solid director, John Flynn, who also made the revenge flick Rolling Thunder in 1977, and in 91 would be responsible for one of Steven Seagal's best movies, Out for Justice.
I'm with Dom Vittorio, so that means you can't touch me.
That's right, I forgot.
He had a good eye for realism, and the movie was actually shot at a real prison in New Jersey where, coincidentally, Chuck Wepner, the boxer whose life loosely inspired Rocky, was doing time. The problem is that Stallone and company seemed to abandon the idea of making a tough-as-nails prison movie and instead opted to make another feel-good drama in the mode of Rocky.
You won't break me.
Thank you so much for watching Sylvester Stallone Revisited. If you like this type of content, make sure to click on the like button as well as the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. Now back to the show. While undeniably entertaining, the finished film contains a lot of hokey cliches and seems almost like a Disney film compared to the realism of subsequent prison dramas, notably HBO's Oz, the movie Shot Caller, which is crazy underrated, and even Disney, through its subsidiary Touchstone, would make a far better prison action movie the following year, An Innocent Man, with Tom Selleck, which I must admit is far less naive about certain aspects of jail than this one is. For one thing, Stallone's Leone is much too clear-cut of a hero. The reason he's been locked up is ridiculous. We find out that he beat up a couple of guys who roughed up the old man who raised him as a surrogate son, and that when the old man died sometime later, he broke out of jail to visit him on his deathbed, despite only having days left to his sentence. The result? A 5-year prison sentence.
You broke the law, and I was punished.
And I got 5 goddamn years and I paid my debt.
To the state, not to me.
Basically, he's a straight-up hero through and through. Donald Sutherland plays the villain, Warden Drumgoole, and him and his COs are all presented as uniformly evil, save for John Amos's Meisner and one other sympathetic guard. The prison camaraderie is unintentionally funny, with no gangs whatsoever except for one evil one, run by Sonny Lanham's evil inmate Chink Weber, which was, funny enough, the name of the character that Stallone had actually intended Chuck Wepner to play in Rocky II, so in some ways it was kind of a homage to the guy.
That's my spot, too.
Any spot in here that isn't yours?
Nope, they're all mine.
Of course, Landham's Chink Weber is in the warden's pocket and is working with him to somehow torture Leone into making an escape attempt or breaking a law. Stallone assembles a friendly, multiracial squad of inmates that are there for each other, and while this is sweet, it also seems naive not to depict the brutal tribalism displayed in pretty much every other prison movie and TV show. Notably, the subject of prison rape never once comes up in the movie, nor is it even hinted at. Again, kinda naive. Instead, the inmates are mostly a solid bunch of dudes working together against the terrible warden. It's extremely simplistic and feels like a prison movie from the 1930s or the 1940s rather than 1989. Stallone, in his prime, could have easily led a dark, violent prison movie that might have been a classic if done right. Apparently, Stallone himself doesn't hold the movie in high regard, telling Entertainment Weekly some years later that it's not a film that was produced or performed with enough maturity to really make a significant impact on the audience or my career. And that's the truth. Indeed, that's pretty clear-eyed of Stallone to admit, although revisiting the film, it can't be denied that if viewed as a straight-ahead action drama, it works more often than it doesn't. Even if Leone is far too clear-cut a hero for a prison movie, Stallone knows how to make a guy you can root for, even if some of the cheer-worthy moments, such as the big knockdown football game with the rousing Bill Conti score, feel really overly manufactured. While in jail, he makes a squad of friends, including a young Tom Sizemore as Dallas. Sizemore is actually terrific in this movie as the desperate inmate you never really trust, and of all of them, he feels like the most legitimate prison character, with his betrayal at the end having both pathos and a rink of redemption.
I'm sorry, man. You were my ticket out of here. I'm sorry.
Frank McRae is lovable as always, as the gruff Eclipse, a hulking prisoner that becomes Leone's pal and protector after saving him during the big football game because he doesn't like bullies. Then there's Larry Romano as the young prisoner first base, who's the kid that Leone takes under his wing and might just as well have been named Dead Meat instead.
I told you we'd play later, you little bitch.
Darlene Flugel is beautiful and sweet as Leone's stalwart girlfriend, while John Amos, a much better actor than anyone ever gave him credit for, is both menacing and kinda likable as one of the few honest guards, but who's also tough as nails.
Are you crazy, Mr. Meisner?
No, but you are. Until this matter is resolved in a judicial inquiry, you will remain in our custody.
Finally, there's Donald Sutherland, who really elevates the movie with his icy, soft-spoken performance as the sadistic drum gold.
This is hard time, Frank. You have no rights here unless I give them to you. You feel no pleasure unless I tell you you can. This is hell.
He underplays the role beautifully, giving the character a true sense of menace, and his comeuppance can't help but make the audience cheer. That, however, is once again an issue with Lock Up. It feels overly manufactured to be this rousing movie, but audiences indeed stayed away in droves. Part of it might be due to the fact that Stallone was mostly known for straight-ahead action at the time, and the movie, well, kind of an action movie, is still short on carnage, save for a well-executed fight with Sonny Landham and the finale when Leone is prompted to escape because he thinks Drumgold is sending an inmate to rape his girlfriend. It's doubly odd that Stallone would follow up Lock Up with another movie that has a big chunk of its running time set in prison, Tango and Cash, but that's a story for another episode.
I think with your IQ, you're unarmed and still very dangerous.
Okay, Sherlock Holmes, if you're so goddamn smart, you tell me who set us up.
I don't know yet.
Yeah, you don't know shit.
In the end, Lock Up was one of Stallone's biggest flops, only grossing about $22 million domestically, which didn't even come close to covering its budget. It ranks as perhaps the most obscure of his 1980s movies, and one very few casual fans of the man have seen. It's up there with movies like Paradise Alley, Fist, and the notorious Rhinestone as kind of forgotten Stallone. While it could and should have been much better, I still find it a mostly entertaining romp that I give 6 out of 10 Stallones. So Lock Up, while definitely not a prison classic and very old-fashioned, is still somewhat entertaining if you're a fan of the man. And given that the show is called Stallone Revisited, you can notably assume that, yes, I am a fan.
When we're in a sober mood, we worry, work, and think. When we're in a drunken mood, we gamble, play, and drink. But when our moods are over, when our time has come to pass, we hope they bury us upside down so the warden can kiss our ass.
At the end of 1990, Stallone's career was definitely at a crossroads, and it's here that perhaps he made one of his most ill-advised decisions, to dive headfirst into comedy. Hey, it worked for Arnold Schwarzenegger, right?
Papa, what have I done?
Nobody hurts my baby.
Stallone's back-to-back comedies, 1991's Oscar and the following year's Stop and My Mom Will Shoot, are widely maligned among critics and fans. Sly himself doesn't seem to have much love for them. So how is it that perhaps the world's biggest action star decides to try his luck at comedy?
This is the point of no return.
The important thing to remember is that at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was always Stallone's biggest rival in terms of box office muscle, was having major success in the genre, having teamed up with Ivan Reitman and Danny DeVito to make Twins, which not only became his biggest hit to date, but it also opened him up to a whole new audience.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
As a child, I remember vividly Twins being the first time I ever got a load of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you know what? It made a super fan of me, and by the time Total Recall and Terminator 2 hit theaters, a lot of the kids that went to see Twins when they were younger were lining up to see him in his hardcore action movies, so it definitely grew his audience. He also reteamed with Ivan Reitman on Kindergarten Cop, which was another pretty big hit, although it did have the misfortune of opening pretty close to Home Alone, so it wasn't quite on the level of Twins.
Shut up! Shut up!
But one could still imagine that Stallone was keen to prove that he could beat the Austrian oak, his greatest rival, at his own game. Here's the thing though, Stallone had actually tried comedy before, and it almost ended his career. Flashback to the year 1984, and two of the biggest hits of the year were Beverly Hills Cop and Romancing the Stone. Sylvester Stallone had actually been offered the leads in both movies, but turned them down. The movie he did do that year was Rhinestone, a comedy that pitted him with Dolly Parton and the director of Porky's, Bob Clark.
I'm laying in the mud, looking at a duck.
To be fair to Stallone, Bob Clark had also just directed A Christmas Story, so, he probably didn't necessarily think he was getting involved with the Schlockmaster. It's worth noting that Bob Clark definitely had one of the weirdest careers on record. I mean, he made one of the greatest slasher movies of all time, Black Christmas, and probably the greatest Christmas movie of all time, A Christmas Story, but the same guy also made, the horn dog teen exploitation classic, Porky's, probably the worst ever Dan Aykroyd movie, Loose Cannons, and ended his career doing Baby Geniuses. Very, very strange filmography. But anyway, getting back to Rhinestone, again, he would team up with Dolly Parton, who plays a country star that's trapped in an abusive contract with a controlling manager who's played by Ron Liebman. She makes him a bet.
Shoot, if I had half a chance, I could turn anybody into a rhinestone cowboy, and I could do it a lot better than you, that's for sure.
Really?
Really.
If she can turn anyone he picks into a country star, she has to be let out of her contract. If she fails in a very 1980s but kind of creepy twist, she'll have to sleep with the horn dog manager. Of course, the guy she has to turn into a country star is Sylvester Stallone, who plays a cab driver she takes up to the mountains to teach a couple of country-fied classics. All it takes is for Stallone to start singing the infamous Drinkenstein number for everyone to see why this movie was a huge flop.
Budweiser, you created a monster, and they call me Drinkenstein.
That said, it's not really all that bad. Sly and Dolly have kind of decent chemistry, they seem to like each other, and when Sly goes country rock at the end to sing Stay Out of My Bedroom, I gotta say, when I was a kid, I thought it was kind of badass, and I was tapping my toe along to the song, especially once Dolly jumps in and they start, duetting. It's pretty awesome, actually. But, I have to say, as a hardcore Stallone fan, I would probably follow him everywhere, which is why I probably gave Rocky V a 6 out of 10. My editor on this show, Bill Mazzola, wanted to murder me for that, but I digress. Rhinestone was pretty bad. Now, given that Sly won a Razzie for it, and the fact that critics and audiences despised it, you'd think it would have scared him off of comedy for good, but it sure didn't. To give Sly credit, the first comedy he did post Rocky V was a pretty underrated flick. Oscar comes from John Landis, whose career was in the dumps following the fallout from the infamous Twilight Zone accident where, one of his stars was beheaded by a helicopter, as well as 2 kids. So, yeah, his reputation in Hollywood wasn't terrific at the time. In it, Sly plays a 1930s gangster named Snaps Provolone, like the cheese.
Can I talk to you alone, Mr. Provolone?
He's trying to leave the rackets behind after a deathbird promise to his father, played by the great Kirk Douglas, who also made a very little-known film with Arnold Schwarzenegger called The Villain. The whole thing is done kind of like a Damon Runyon-style comedy, with Provolone and his lighthearted gangster cronies trying to figure out who impregnated his teenage daughter, played by young Marisa Tomei, who embezzled money from him, and they want to keep him out of jail long enough for him to buy his way into big business so he can go legit.
Jeez, I'm used to dealing with mobsters, bootleggers, and gunzels, but you bankers?
Scary.
It's actually kind of funny in an old-fashioned way. One of the great gangster stars of the 30s and 40s, Edward G. Robinson, made a whole slew of movies like this, and I'm pretty sure that that's what Landis was going for here. Who offers an early role for Chaz Palminteri, who would break out pretty big 2 years later by writing and co-starring in A Bronx Tale. Meanwhile, there's also Peter Riegert, yes, the great Peter Riegert from Animal House as Sly's number 2, who mercilessly steals scenes from him from start to finish.
Teresa's pregnant?
Teresa's pregnant? Who's Teresa?
My daughter, you sap.
It also has a nice role from Marisa Tomei that probably won her the star-making part she would get a year later in My Cousin Vinny, while Tim Curry, the great Don Amici, and more put in welcome appearances. Some critics sneered at the movie just because it happened to star Stallone, and it didn't help that Landis, of course, at the time, was one of the most despised men in Hollywood. But some critics have actually come out in support of it retrospectively. Still, it was a big financial flop, grossing $23 million, which was even less than Rocky V, and it certainly didn't help his career.
Sorry, Papa, I did the best I could.
Still, I have a soft spot for it. Like Over the Top, it was probably one of the Stallone movies, oddly enough, that I watched the most as a kid, so I'd give it probably a 7 out of 10.
I don't even know what I'm talking about!
Still, Sly's biggest disaster as a movie star, perhaps throughout his entire career, was still to come with him making the ill-advised decision to make Stop or My Mom Will Shoot next. The urban legend behind this was that Arnold Schwarzenegger faked interest in what he knew was a terrible script to get Stallone to star in it. Oh, the mischievous Austrian.
Born to be bad. Yes, we are.
This story always sounded very unlikely until Schwarzenegger himself confirmed it in a magazine interview, so yep, it's actually all true. What a wacky guy. To give Sly the benefit of the doubt, it probably seemed like a pretty safe bet. I mean, the movie came from the writers of Twins, and it was produced by Ivan Reitman. Something somewhere went terribly, terribly wrong. Perhaps it was the choice of Roger Spottiswoode to direct. A solid action director who did movies like Air America and the James Bond movie Tomorrow Never Dies, he never really had the light touch he needed for comedy. His previous comedy, Turner and Hooch, ended with Tom Hanks shooting Coach Craig T. Nelson in the face with a shotgun while his beloved canine partner died an agonizingly slow death. It ruined many a kid's birthday parties, including my own. Stop or My Mom Will Shoot stars Sylvester Stallone as a cop with commitment issues. He's dating his sexy captain, played by Jo Beth Williams, but he's insecure about her being his boss.
Oh, the feeling stuff.
Right. The feeling stuff.
Partly because he has some mommy issues. His overprotective mom, Estelle Getty's Tootie, comes to visit and becomes embroiled in an arms smuggling ring, and it ends with him and his mom getting into a gunfight with the villains. She backs him up, and he delivers that iconic phrase that gives the movie its title.
Stop! Or my mom will shoot!
So at the time, Estelle Getty was a pretty big star, playing the smart-mouthed Sophia on the great show Golden Girls. Originally, the mother character was supposed to be monstrous because, you know, Estelle Getty as Sophia was always kind of a bitch, right? I mean, that's why everybody loved her so much on the show. But apparently, Getty was so sweet behind the scenes that they couldn't bear and make her unlikable, so they changed her into a sweetheart, probably ruining the film to some extent. The resulting movie was so tame that they had to cut in a long shot of Sly's ass just to earn the movie a PG-13 rating, lest it be considered for a terminally uncool PG rating. This was actually the first Stallone movie I ever saw in theaters. Yes, that's right. Stop or My Mom Will Shoot was the first time I ever saw Sylvester Stallone in 35mm on the big screen. Yeah, not the best introduction, but, you know, I'd seen all the Rambo movies at that point, so I knew he wasn't just some wacky comedy guy. The movie was a complete fiasco, despite me buying a ticket to it, only grossing $28 million, but worldwide, funny enough, it actually turned a profit. Stallone, for obvious reasons, is not a fan of this film, not a surprise. And once again, Stallone, quote-unquote, won a Razzie. It was bad enough that this would put an end to his aspirations of making a hit comedy forevermore. Happily for Stallone, the next year would see the release of not one but two of his greatest movies ever, and by the end of the year, he would once again be a $20 million movie superstar and would briefly be again the king of action in Hollywood. But that's a story for another time. Meanwhile, I give Stop or My Mom Will Shoot probably the lowest rating I've ever given a movie on Sly Revisited, an abysmal 0 out of 10. Talk to you again soon on the next episode of Sly Revisited.
You shot him.
No shit.